The violent crack of a Winchester rifle shattered the dawn silence as blood sprayed across the freshly fallen snow. Samuel Keller dropped to one knee, his right arm hanging uselessly at his side, crimson staining the sleeve of his worn leather jacket. The cattle rustlers who'd ambushed him were already disappearing into the pine forest that bordered his small ranch in Colorado Territory, 1876. The stolen cattle would be long gone by nightfall, but that was the least of his concerns now. The bullet had torn through his forearm, and as he struggled to stem the bleeding with a bandana, Samuel knew that without help, he might not last until sundown. Samuel had built his life around his hands. For 15 years, those strong, weathered appendages had broken horses, roped cattle, built fences, and lately, even begun crafting intricate leather pieces that he sold in town for extra money. Now, as he stumbled toward his cabin, those same hands trembled uncontrollably, one from blood loss, the other from fear. His vision blurred as he reached the cabin's porch, collapsing against the rough-hewn logs. The modest home he'd built with those same now failing hands swam before his eyes. Samuel was 32 years old and had survived the Civil War, cattle stampedes, and a winter so brutal it had killed half the settlers in the valley. He wasn't ready to die from a rustler's bullet on his own doorstep. "Mr. Keller? Samuel? Oh my God!" The voice cut through his pain-fogged consciousness. Hannah Goodwin, the new schoolteacher who'd arrived in Timberline just 3 months prior. What was she doing here, 15 miles from town? "Miss Goodwin," he managed, his voice gravel rough. "You shouldn't be seeing me like this." Hannah dropped from her horse, her dark blue riding skirt billowing as she rushed to his side. At 25, she was tall and slender, with auburn hair typically pinned in a severe bun befitting her position. Now, loose tendrils escaped, framing a face marked with concern rather than its usual reserved politeness. "I was bringing books," she explained, kneeling beside him. "For your niece. You mentioned she was visiting." Her words faltered as she assessed his wound. "You've been shot." Samuel tried to nod, but the movement sent pain radiating through his entire body. "Rustlers. Took 5 head. Hannah's face hardened with determination. "The cattle can wait. This needs tending now." Without hesitation, she tore a strip from her petticoat and wrapped it tightly around his arm. "Can you stand? We need to get inside." Samuel wasn't used to being helped. Since his brother Thomas had moved east with his family 2 years ago, he'd lived alone, relying on no one. The idea of leaning on the prim schoolteacher seemed absurd, but as another wave of dizziness washed over him, he realized he had no choice. "I think so," he muttered, though his legs felt like water. Hannah positioned herself under his good arm, surprisingly strong for someone who spent her days with chalk and primers. With her support, Samuel staggered inside the cabin, collapsing onto the narrow bed in the corner. "Water," she instructed, already moving to the basin by the window, "and whiskey if you have it." "Cupboard above the stove," Samuel directed, watching through pain-narrowed eyes as she moved efficiently around his home. Hannah returned with a basin of water, a bottle of whiskey, and clean rags she'd found in a drawer. "This will hurt," she warned, pouring a liberal amount of whiskey over the wound. Samuel bit back a scream, his face contorting as liquid fire seemed to consume his arm. Hannah didn't flinch, her hands steady as she cleaned the wound, examining it with a critical eye. "The bullet went through cleanly," she said after a moment. "That's fortunate. I need to stop the bleeding and bandage it properly." She hesitated. "I'm not a doctor, but my father was. I assisted him often before he died." Samuel's eyes widened slightly. The schoolteacher had never mentioned a medical background during her brief time in Timberline. "Guess today's my lucky day, then," he managed through clenched teeth. Hannah's lips curved in a small, tight smile. "Perhaps, though I imagine you'd prefer not to have been shot at all." She reached for needle and thread from her satchel. Apparently, schoolteachers came prepared for emergencies. "I need to stitch this." Samuel nodded, reaching for the whiskey with his good hand. He took a long pull, the burn in his throat a welcome distraction from the fire in his arm. Hannah waited patiently, then took his injured arm in her hands. Her touch was gentle but confident, her fingers cool against his feverish skin. As she began to stitch, Samuel was struck by the contrast between them. Her hands were smooth and unblemished, the hands of someone who worked with books and paper. His were rough and calloused, marked by scars and years of hard labor. "You've good hands," he murmured, the whiskey and blood loss making him bolder than usual. "Steady." Hannah's eyes flickered to his face, then back to her work. "A teacher needs steady hands for writing on the blackboard," she replied, though a slight blush colored her cheeks. "And my father insisted I learn proper suturing. Said it was a skill everyone should have in territories like this." "Smart man." "He was." Her voice softened with memory. "He came west to Colorado when I was 12. Wanted to help where doctors were scarce." Samuel watched her face as she worked, noticing details he'd previously missed during their brief interactions in town, the light dusting of freckles across her nose, the determined set of her jaw, the surprising strength in her slender fingers. "Why teaching?" he asked, partly to distract himself from the pain, partly out of genuine curiosity about this woman who was literally holding his life in her hands. "If you know medicine?" Hannah tied off a stitch before answering. "After Father died, I couldn't continue alone. No one would accept a woman physician, especially not one so young." A shadow crossed her face. "Teaching was respectable, available, and I do love the children." Samuel nodded, understanding more than she probably realized. After the war, he'd made choices based on necessity rather than passion too. "Still, seems a waste." She glanced at him sharply. "Education is never a waste, Mr. Keller." "Samuel," he corrected. "Reckon a woman stitching bullet holes in me should use my Christian name." That earned him another small smile. "Samuel." Then she finished the final stitch and began wrapping clean bandages around his arm. "And I suppose you should call me Hannah, though not in front of my students. I have a reputation to maintain." The way she said it with a hint of humor beneath her proper tone made him wonder how much of the rigid schoolmarm was a carefully constructed facade. "You're lucky," Hannah continued, tying off the bandage. "The bullet missed anything vital, but you've lost blood. An infection is still a risk." She stood, smoothing her skirt with hands that now bore smudges of his blood. "You need rest and someone to watch that wound. Your niece isn't coming," Samuel interrupted. "Thomas wrote last week. Alice took ill, so they postponed their visit." Hannah frowned. "Is there someone in town who could stay with you? Mrs. Peterson, perhaps?" Or, "No," Samuel said firmly. "I've managed alone for years. I'll be fine." Hannah's frown deepened. "You can barely stand. The wound needs cleaning and redressing. You need food, water." She trailed off, clearly calculating something in her mind. "It's Friday. School won't resume until Monday." "What are you suggesting?" Samuel asked, though he already suspected her answer. "I'll stay until Sunday," Hannah stated, her tone leaving no room for argument. "By then, you should be stable enough to manage on your own, or I can send someone from town." Samuel opened his mouth to protest, but found he lacked the energy. The pain and blood loss were taking their toll, and the room had begun to spin alarmingly. "It's not proper," he managed weakly. "Your reputation—" Hannah actually laughed at that, a surprisingly rich, warm sound. "Mr. Keller, Samuel, I just rode 15 miles alone to deliver books to a child. I think my reputation for impropriety is already established in certain circles." She moved to the stove. "Now rest while I make something for you to eat. You need to rebuild your strength." As she busied herself with the stove, Samuel found his eyelids growing heavy. The last thing he saw before drifting into unconsciousness was Hannah Goodwin rolling up her sleeves, her blood-stained hands moving with purpose through his kitchen as if she belonged there. Samuel awoke to darkness and the disorienting confusion of fever. The cabin was illuminated only by the soft glow of the fireplace, shadows dancing across the log walls. For a moment, he couldn't remember why his arm throbbed with such intensity, why his body felt simultaneously freezing and burning. "Easy," came a soft voice, and then Hannah was beside him, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. "You've developed a fever, but it's not dangerous yet." Memory returned in fragments, the rustlers, the shooting, Hannah's unexpected arrival. He tried to sit up but fell back with a groan. "Don't move," she instructed firmly. "You need to conserve your strength." Samuel licked his dry lips. "How long was I asleep?" "Several hours. It's just past midnight." Hannah helped him take a sip of water from a tin cup. "I managed to get some broth into you earlier, but you weren't fully conscious." Samuel studied her in the firelight. She had removed her formal jacket, working now in just her white blouse and dark skirt. Her hair had been freed from its pins and hung in a long braid down her back, making her look younger, less severe. "You should sleep," he said, noticing the fatigue in her eyes. "Take the bed. I can move to the chair." Hannah shook her head. "I've made a pallet by the fire. You're not moving anywhere." She gestured to a makeshift bed of blankets on the floor. "I've been alternating between reading and checking your fever." Samuel followed her gaze to the book open on the hearth. "What are you reading?" "Tennyson," she replied, a faint smile touching her lips. "I find poetry comforting during vigils." "Read to me?" The request surprised them both. Samuel wasn't a man who asked for comforts, and certainly not poetry. But the fever had lowered his defenses, and Hannah's voice was soothing in the lonely darkness of his cabin. Hannah hesitated only briefly before retrieving the book. She settled onto a chair beside his bed and began to read, her voice soft but clear in the quiet night. Samuel let the words wash over him, not always understanding their meaning, but finding solace in their rhythm and in Hannah's gentle recitation. Sometime during the reading, his trembling hand sought hers. Hannah paused only momentarily before allowing her fingers to intertwine with his, providing an anchor against the fever's disorienting waves. There was something profoundly intimate about the gesture, more so than the fact that she had seen him vulnerable, had touched his wounds, had stayed in his home unchaperoned. "Your hands are still trembling," she observed quietly, setting the book aside. "Not from the wound now," Samuel admitted, the fever making him uncharacteristically honest. "It's been years since anyone's shown me kindness without expectation." Hannah's expression softened. "Perhaps the fever is making you melancholy," she suggested, though she didn't withdraw her hand. "Perhaps," he agreed, though they both knew it wasn't just the fever talking. Eventually, Samuel drifted back to sleep, Hannah's hand still holding his, steadying the tremors that had nothing to do with physical pain. The next morning brought clarity and embarrassment. Samuel woke to sunlight streaming through the cabin windows and the realization that he had been unnervingly vulnerable with the town schoolteacher. Hannah was already up, her hair once again pinned properly, tending to something at the stove that filled the cabin with the rich aroma of coffee. "Your fever broke around dawn," she informed him, bringing a cup of the steaming liquid to his bedside. "How do you feel?" "Better," he said, carefully testing his injured arm. The pain remained, but the worst of it had subsided. "Thank you for everything." Hannah nodded, her manner more reserved than it had been during the night. Samuel wondered if she too was feeling the awkwardness of their situation in the harsh light of day. "I should check your bandages," she said professionally, setting the coffee within his reach. Samuel nodded, shifting to make it easier for her to access his wound. As she unwrapped the bandages, her fingers brushing against his skin, he found himself studying her face. In daylight, he could see the shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of her nighttime vigil. "You didn't sleep much," he observed. Hannah shrugged slightly. "I've never been one to sleep deeply. Even as a child, I would wake at the slightest sound." She examined the wound with a clinical eye. "This looks better than I expected. No signs of serious infection." As she worked to clean and rebandage the injury, Samuel found himself increasingly aware of her proximity. the faint scent of lavender that clung to her skin, the slight furrow between her brows as she concentrated. "I've been thinking," Hannah said, breaking the silence. "You won't be able to handle the ranch work one-armed, at least not for a while." Samuel grimaced. "I'll manage. Have to." "Actually, you don't," Hannah countered, securing the fresh bandage. "School doesn't start until 9. I could ride out each morning to help with essential tasks before heading to town." Samuel stared at her, astonished. "That's nearly an hour's ride each way." "I'm an early riser," she said simply. "Why would you do that?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. Hannah Goodwin had already gone well beyond what anyone would expect of an acquaintance. Hannah met his gaze directly. "Because you need help, and I'm in a position to offer it." She hesitated, then added more softly, "And because I understand what it means to be alone when you're vulnerable." There was a story there. Samuel realized something beyond the loss of her father that had shaped this woman who combined schoolmarm propriety with unexpected resilience. "The town won't approve," he warned, "a single woman visiting a bachelor's ranch daily." "The town already considers me somewhat peculiar," Hannah replied with a hint of wryness. "I ride astride rather than side saddle. I've been known to wear trousers when the weather demands it, and I teach scientific principles that some find questionable." She shrugged. "What's one more eccentricity?" Samuel couldn't help but smile. "You're not what I expected, Miss Goodwin." "Hannah," she corrected, a slight smile touching her lips. "And I suspect you have more layers than the town gives you credit for as well, Samuel Keller." For the remainder of the weekend, they settled into an unexpectedly comfortable routine. Hannah tended to Samuel's wound, prepared meals, and helped with the minimal chores needed to keep the small ranch functioning. Samuel, for his part, improved enough to move around the cabin, though Hannah strictly forbade any strenuous activity. They talked more than Samuel had talked to anyone in years. Hannah told him about growing up with her physician father after her mother died, about assisting with surgeries from the age of 14, about her dreams of someday opening a school that taught girls practical medicine alongside traditional subjects. Samuel shared stories of his time in the war, his journey west with Thomas, and his recent interest in leatherworking. "May I see some of your work?" Hannah asked on Sunday afternoon as they sat on the porch, taking advantage of the unseasonably warm day. Samuel hesitated, then nodded toward a trunk near his bed. "In there, the smaller pieces." Hannah retrieved the trunk and brought it outside. Inside were intricately tooled leather items, belts, pouches, a few book covers, and smaller decorative pieces. She handled them with reverence, tracing the detailed patterns with her fingertips. "These are beautiful," she said with genuine admiration. "This isn't just craft, Samuel. It's art." Samuel felt an unfamiliar warmth at her praise. "Just something to keep my hands busy during the winters. Sells well enough in town." "You should be charging more," Hannah insisted, examining a particularly detailed belt. "This level of craftsmanship is rare." She looked up at him with a question in her eyes. "Have you ever considered making this your primary work instead of ranching?" The question caught Samuel off guard. "Can't make a living on trinkets." "These aren't trinkets," Hannah countered, "and I suspect you could make larger pieces saddles, tack that would fetch good prices." She carefully replaced the items in the trunk. "You have a gift, Samuel. Your hands create beauty." Samuel looked down at his hands, one still bandaged, both still occasionally trembling from weakness. No one had ever described anything about him as beautiful before. "Maybe someday," he said noncommittally, though the seed of possibility had been planted. Sunday evening came too quickly. As Hannah packed her few belongings, preparing to return to town before nightfall, Samuel felt an unexpected sense of loss. The cabin would be empty again, silent save for his own movements. "I'll return tomorrow morning," Hannah promised, securing her satchel. "Around 6, if that's not too early." "You don't have to do that," Samuel said, though part of him desperately hoped she would. "I can manage." Hannah gave him a knowing look. "You can barely lift a coffee pot with that arm. Don't be stubborn out of pride." She pulled on her riding gloves. "I'll help with the essential chores, check your wound, and then head to school. I can return briefly after classes if needed." Samuel walked her to her horse, conscious that this was the first time in years he regretted seeing someone leave his property. "Thank you again," he said awkwardly as she mounted. "Not many would have done what you did." Hannah looked down at him, her expression softening. "Perhaps you've simply known the wrong people, Samuel Keller." With a slight smile, she added, "Rest that arm. Doctor's orders." As he watched her ride away, Samuel realized two things simultaneously. His hands had finally stopped trembling, and Hannah Goodwin had somehow, in just 3 days, become essential to him in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend. True to her word, Hannah arrived as dawn was breaking the next morning. Samuel, who had slept poorly without her presence, heard the approach of her horse and was already at the door when she dismounted. "You should be resting," she chided, taking in his haggard appearance. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted, taking her saddlebag despite her protests. Too quiet. A hint of understanding passed between them, an acknowledgement that something had shifted during their days together. Hannah quickly settled into a routine, efficiently handling the morning chores that Samuel directed her through but couldn't perform himself. She fed the remaining cattle and the 2 horses in the corral, collected eggs from the small hen house, and even managed to milk the cantankerous old cow that Samuel had been certain would never accept a stranger. "You've done this before," Samuel observed, watching from the porch as Hannah completed tasks that most town-dwelling schoolteachers would find foreign. "I grew up on a small farm before Father moved us west," she explained, carrying a bucket of fresh milk toward the house. "Though I admit, your cow has a particularly unpleasant temperament." "Matilda hates everyone equally," Samuel said with a chuckle. "It's part of her charm." Hannah's visit ended too soon, with a quick check of his bandages and a promise to return the following morning. The pattern continued through the week, Hannah arriving at dawn, working alongside Samuel for an hour or so, then riding to town for her teaching duties. Sometimes she would return briefly in the evenings, especially if the weather was fair and daylight permitted safe travel. Word spread through Timberline about the arrangement, bringing mixed reactions. Sheriff Wade Porter rode out midweek, ostensibly to investigate the rustling, but clearly also checking on the propriety of the situation. "Miss Goodwin's a respected member of this community," the sheriff said carefully, after taking Samuel's statement about the theft. "People are talking about her daily visits here." "Miss Goodwin saved my life," Samuel replied evenly, "and she's helping me keep this ranch going until I can use my arm again. There's nothing improper happening." The sheriff studied him for a long moment. "Known you a long time, Samuel. You're a good man. Just make sure this situation doesn't harm her standing in town. Women have fewer options than we do out here." After the sheriff left, Samuel found himself dwelling on the warning. He hadn't considered how much Hannah might be risking by helping him. That evening when she stopped by, he broached the subject. "Sheriff mentioned people are talking," he said as she changed his bandages on the porch. "About you coming here." Hannah's hands paused briefly before resuming their work. People always talk. It's the favorite pastime in small towns. "I don't want to cause trouble for you." Hannah secured the fresh bandage before meeting his eyes. "Samuel, I'm a grown woman who makes her own decisions. I was aware of the potential for gossip when I offered to help." "Still," he persisted, "your position is secure," she interrupted firmly. "The school board may not always approve of my methods, but they know I'm an excellent teacher. Besides," she added with a slight smile, "half the board members have children whose lives I saved during the diphtheria outbreak last winter. They won't dismiss me over helping an injured neighbor." Samuel hadn't heard about her role during the outbreak. "You never mentioned that." Hannah shrugged, packing away her medical supplies. "It wasn't relevant." After a moment, she added more softly, "I couldn't save them all. 3 children died, despite everything I tried." The pain in her voice was unmistakable. Samuel reached for her hand without thinking. "But how many lived because of you?" Hannah looked at their joined hands, then at his face. 14, she whispered. 14 survived. Then you did what even a trained doctor might not have managed, Samuel said, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. Those families owe you everything. Hannah's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. I should have saved them all. Hannah, Samuel said gently, no one could have. They sat in silence for several minutes, hands still connected, as the sun began to set over the mountains. Finally, Hannah withdrew her hand and stood. I should go before it gets too dark, she said, though she sounded reluctant. Samuel nodded, rising to walk her to her horse. As she mounted, he found himself saying, Come for dinner tomorrow. It's Saturday, no school. I can manage something simple as thanks for all you've done. Hannah looked surprised but pleased. That would be lovely, though you shouldn't be cooking with that arm. I can manage soup and biscuits one-handed, he assured her. Nothing fancy, but it'll be hot. Hannah smiled a full, genuine smile that transformed her face. I'll bring dessert, she promised, then turned her horse toward town. Samuel watched until she disappeared from view, wondering when exactly the prim schoolteacher had become so important to him and what he would do when his arm healed and he no longer had a legitimate reason to see her every day. Saturday dawned clear and cold, a reminder that winter was not yet finished with Colorado. Samuel rose early, determined to prepare a decent meal despite his injury. By noon, he had a pot of venison stew simmering on the stove, awkwardly prepared but flavorful, and was attempting to mix biscuit dough when Hannah arrived. "What are you doing?" she exclaimed, rushing to take the bowl from him after removing her coat. "You'll tear those stitches." "Making dinner as promised," Samuel replied stubbornly. "I'm managing fine." Hannah gave him a skeptical look. "Your definition of fine needs revision." She examined the sticky mess in the bowl. "Let me help with these at least." Working together in the small kitchen created a domestic intimacy neither had expected. Hannah's shoulder occasionally brushed against Samuel's good arm as they moved around each other, her laughter filling the cabin when flour dusted both their clothes after a minor mishap. "I'm afraid I'm a better nurse than a cook," she admitted, attempting to salvage the misshapen biscuits. "My boarding house meals are prepared by Mrs. Hollister." "They're perfect," Samuel insisted, enjoying her rare moment of imperfection. "Character builds flavor." Hannah laughed again, the sound becoming increasingly familiar and precious to Samuel. A diplomatic assessment. She placed the biscuits in the oven, then turned to him with flour-smudged cheeks. "Now, sit before you undo all my careful medical work." They ate at the small table Samuel had crafted years earlier, the stew surprisingly tasty despite his one-handed preparation. Hannah had brought apple pie from town, and they lingered over dessert and coffee as afternoon shadows lengthened across the cabin floor. "I've been thinking," Samuel said finally, gathering his courage, "about what you said regarding my leather work." Hannah's eyes brightened with interest. "Have you considered focusing on it more seriously?" "I have," he admitted. "This ranch," he gestured toward the window, "it's never been what I truly wanted. It was Thomas's dream more than mine. I followed him west because we were all each other had after the war." "What did you want?" Hannah asked softly. Samuel hesitated, never having voiced his true ambition aloud. "I apprenticed briefly with a saddle maker in Virginia before the war. I wanted to continue that path, but afterward," he shrugged. "Opportunities were limited. Thomas had this vision of cattle and open spaces." "It's not too late," Hannah suggested, leaning forward eagerly. "You have talent, Samuel. Exceptional talent." "Maybe," he conceded. "Been thinking of converting part of the barn to a proper workshop. Might take some commissions, see if there's interest." "There will be," Hannah assured him with such conviction that Samuel couldn't help but believe her. "Once people see what you can create, you'll have more work than you can handle." The conversation shifted to practical considerations, tools he would need, potential markets beyond timberline, how to balance ranching with leatherwork initially. As they talked, Samuel realized how long it had been since he'd shared his thoughts with someone who truly listened, who offered insights rather than judgments. Outside, snow began to fall gently at first, then with increasing intensity. Hannah moved to the window with concern. "I should leave soon if I'm to make it back before dark." Samuel joined her, frowning at the rapidly accumulating snow. "This isn't a light dusting, it's coming down too hard." He turned to her with reluctance. "It's not safe to ride back tonight." Hannah bit her lip, clearly understanding the implications. "Perhaps if I leave immediately." "Hannah," Samuel said firmly, "that's 15 miles in a snowstorm, with darkness coming. Even an experienced rider would be foolish to attempt it." She sighed, knowing he was right. "The town will certainly talk now." "To hell with the town," Samuel said with unexpected vehemence. "Your safety matters more than gossip." Hannah looked up at him, something shifting in her expression. "Thank you," she said softly. Then, with a hint of her practical nature reasserting itself, "I suppose we should discuss sleeping arrangements." "You'll take the bed," Samuel said immediately. "I'll make a pallet by the fire like you did when I was injured." Hannah shook her head. "Your arm is still healing. You need proper rest on a mattress." "I'm not taking the bed while you sleep on the floor," Samuel insisted. They stared at each other, equally stubborn, until Hannah suggested a compromise. "We could share it. The bed is narrow but adequate for two if we're careful." Samuel felt heat rise in his face at the suggestion. "That wouldn't be proper." A hint of amusement crossed Hannah's features. "Samuel, I'm already spending the night unchaperoned in your cabin. I think propriety has long since departed this situation." Despite his concerns, Samuel couldn't argue with her logic. They prepared for bed awkwardly, Hannah borrowing one of his clean shirts to sleep in, each taking turns to change privately behind a blanket strung across a corner of the cabin. When they finally lay side by side on the narrow mattress, careful inches separating them, Samuel felt simultaneously exhausted and more awake than he'd ever been. Hannah's breathing was measured but not deep enough for sleep. "Your arm is hurting," she observed after several silent minutes. "I can feel you tensing." "It's manageable," Samuel replied, though the throbbing had indeed intensified. Without warning, Hannah reached across the space between them and took his hand in hers, her fingers gently massaging his palm and wrist below the bandaged area. The unexpected contact made Samuel's breath catch. "My father taught me that pain often radiates," she explained softly. "Easing tension in the surrounding areas can help." Whether it was her technique or simply her touch, Samuel found the pain indeed subsiding. Hannah's fingers moved methodically, her touch professional yet somehow deeply intimate in the darkness. "Better?" she asked. "Yes," Samuel managed, though "better" hardly described the complex sensations her touch evoked. His hands had stopped trembling entirely, replaced by a different kind of tension. Hannah didn't withdraw her hand, instead letting it rest lightly in his. "I've enjoyed these days, Samuel," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "despite the circumstances that brought them about." In the darkness, honesty came easier. "I have too," Samuel confessed, "more than I should." "Why should?" Hannah questioned. "Is enjoyment forbidden?" Samuel sighed. "We're from different worlds, Hannah. You're educated, refined. I'm just a rancher with dirt under my nails and barely enough schooling to keep accounts." Hannah's fingers tightened on his. "That's not how I see you. I see a man of integrity and talent who endured war and hardship without letting it break his spirit, who creates beauty with hands that have known pain." Her voice softened further. "A man I've come to care for deeply." The admission hung in the air between them, momentous and fragile. Samuel turned on his side to face her, though in the darkness he could barely make out her features. "I've never met anyone like you," he said finally. "Never expected to find someone who would look at me and see more than what's on the surface." Hannah's free hand reached up to touch his face, fingers tracing his jawline with tender exploration. Perhaps you should have higher expectations. Samuel caught her hand and pressed it to his lips in a gesture that surprised them both. Hannah's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the quiet cabin. "Hannah," he whispered, a question in his voice. In answer, she moved closer, eliminating the careful space between them. When their lips met, it was gentle and questioning at first, then deepening with shared certainty. Samuel's good arm wrapped around her, drawing her closer still, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Hannah rested her head on his shoulder. "This complicates things," she murmured, though she sounded more pleased than concerned. "Considerably," Samuel agreed, his fingers stroking her hair, freed from its pins for sleep. "But I find I don't mind complications of this nature." They talked late into the night, sharing confidences, fears, and hopes in the intimate darkness. When Samuel finally drifted to sleep, it was with Hannah curled against his side, her steady breathing a comfort he hadn't known he needed. Morning brought clarity rather than regret. Samuel woke to find Hannah already up, dressed in yesterday's clothes, preparing coffee at the stove. When she turned and saw him watching her, her smile held no hesitation. "The snow's stopped," she reported, bringing him a steaming cup. "The trail should be passable within a few hours." Samuel sat up, testing his injured arm. The pain had receded to a dull ache, and the trembling that had plagued him since the shooting was completely gone. "Will you return to town today?" Hannah sat beside him on the edge of the bed. "I should. My absence has surely been noticed already." She hesitated. "But I can come back tomorrow after church." Samuel took her hand, marveling at how natural the gesture already felt. "I'd like that. But Hannah, we should talk about what happens when my arm heals completely, when I no longer have a legitimate reason for your daily visits." "Is that what concerns you?" Hannah asked with a slight smile. "Convention?" "Your reputation matters," Samuel insisted. "Your position in the community." Hannah considered this, her thumb absently stroking the back of his hand. "There are traditional solutions to such situations," she said finally, a hint of color rising in her cheeks. Samuel's heart quickened. "Are you suggesting what I think you are?" "Perhaps," Hannah met his gaze directly, "unless I've misunderstood what's developing between us." "You haven't," Samuel assured her quickly. "But marriage is significant. We've known each other only a short time." Hannah's expression grew thoughtful. "In ordinary circumstances, I'd agree. But I think when you've seen someone at their most vulnerable, tended their wounds, shared their darkest hours and brightest hopes," she shrugged slightly. "Perhaps time measures differently then." Samuel brought her hand to his lips. "I don't have much to offer a woman like you." "You have everything to offer that matters to me," Hannah countered firmly. "Integrity, kindness, respect for my mind as well as my heart." Her voice softened. "And hands that create beauty even after knowing violence." The mention of his hands made Samuel look down at them, one still bandaged but healing, both now steady in a way they hadn't been since the shooting. He thought about how Hannah had taken those hands in hers that first day, unflinching despite the blood and dirt, and every day since with increasing tenderness. "It won't be easy," he warned. "The ranch barely breaks even most years. My leather work is untested as a business." Hannah smiled with surprising confidence. "I have some savings from my teaching, and I've been thinking that perhaps I could offer nursing services locally, nothing that would interfere with my teaching duties, but enough to help establish your workshop." The casual way she included herself in his future plans made Samuel's chest tighten with emotion. "You've thought this through." "I tend to analyze situations thoroughly," Hannah acknowledged with a hint of self-deprecation. "It's both a strength and an annoyance, according to my students." "I find it endearing," Samuel assured her, drawing her closer. "Hannah Goodwin, are you proposing to me?" Hannah laughed, the sound warm and bright in the morning light. "I believe I am, though it's hardly conventional. Does that trouble you?" Samuel shook his head, amazed at how his life had transformed in just 1 week. "Nothing about us has been conventional from the start. Why change now?" He grew serious. "But I want to do this properly. Let me court you openly. Give the town time to adjust to the idea of us together. Then, when my arm is fully healed." Hannah nodded, understanding his intent. "A proper courtship would be nice, though I think we've rather accelerated the getting-to-know-you phase." Samuel chuckled, then sobered. "I never expected this. After Thomas left, I thought I'd live out my days alone on this ranch. And I never expected to find someone who would see beyond the schoolteacher to the woman beneath," Hannah replied softly. "Someone who would value my medical knowledge rather than dismiss it." Samuel pulled her gently into his arms. "I value everything about you, Hannah Goodwin. Your mind, your heart, your healing hands." He kissed her forehead. "And I'll spend however long you'll let me showing you exactly how much." Hannah's return to town later that day caused the expected stir, but she faced the whispers and questions with composed dignity. When Samuel rode in the following Saturday, his arm still bandaged but functional enough for the journey, and formally called on her at her boarding house, the town's gossip shifted from scandal to romance. Their courtship progressed through the spring with a foundation already built through those intense early days. Hannah continued to help at the ranch, but now their time together included picnics by the creek, reading poetry aloud on the porch, and Samuel teaching Hannah the basics of leatherworking with her eager assistance. By early summer, Samuel's arm had healed completely, leaving only a scar to mark the event that had brought Hannah into his life. The trembling that had plagued his hands never returned, a fact Hannah attributed to proper medical care, though Samuel privately believed it had more to do with her presence than her medicine. With Hannah's encouragement, Samuel converted part of the barn into a workshop and began taking commissions for leather goods. His reputation spread quickly, especially after the new banker's wife from Denver commissioned an intricately tooled leather portfolio that caught everyone's attention. Hannah, meanwhile, continued teaching, but also began offering basic nursing services on weekends, her dual skills increasingly valued by the growing community. Together, they found a balance that allowed each to pursue their passions while building a shared future. On a warm evening in late June, exactly 3 months after the shooting that had brought them together, Samuel took Hannah to the highest point on his property, where the view stretched across the valley to the distant mountains. There, with the sunset painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, he knelt on the ground and presented her with a small leather box he had crafted himself. "I wanted to ask you properly," he said, opening the box to reveal a simple gold ring with a small pearl. "Hannah Goodwin, will you marry me?" Hannah's eyes filled with tears as she nodded, dropping to her knees to join him on the ground. "Yes," she whispered, framing his face with her hands. 1,000 times yes. As Samuel slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that moved with confident steadiness, he marveled at how completely his life had transformed. From lonely rancher to a man with purpose and partnership, from hands that trembled with pain to hands that created beauty and held love. "Your hands are so steady now," Hannah observed, intertwining her fingers with his. Samuel smiled, raising their joined hands to kiss her knuckles. "They found what they needed," he said simply. "They found you." They married in August under an arch Samuel had built on the ranch, decorated with wildflowers Hannah had gathered with her students. The entire town attended. Any previous gossip forgotten in the face of a love that had become a favorite local story, the wounded rancher and the schoolteacher who healed more than just his injuries. As years passed, the ranch evolved. The cattle herd diminished as Samuel's reputation as a master leatherworker grew, eventually allowing them to convert most of the property to a workshop and home. Hannah continued teaching while establishing a small clinic in their home, where she treated everything from broken bones to delivering babies, finally putting her medical knowledge to full use with the town's blessing. When their first child arrived a year after their wedding, a daughter they named Elizabeth after Hannah's mother. Samuel marveled at how confidently Hannah's hands cradled their infant, and how his own hands, once uncertain and pain-ridden, now moved with sure purpose, whether crafting fine leather or holding his child. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, 5-year-old Elizabeth asleep in Hannah's lap and their 2-year-old son Thomas playing at their feet, Samuel took his wife's hand, running his thumb over the simple gold band he'd placed there years before. "I've been thinking about the day we met," he said quietly. "How close I came to bleeding out alone in the snow." Hannah squeezed his hand. "I still don't know what made me decide to deliver those books that specific day. I'd been planning the trip for weeks but kept postponing it." "Providence," Samuel suggested, "or extremely good luck on my part." Hannah smiled, the years having only enhanced her beauty in Samuel's eyes. "Either way, I'm grateful every day that I found you." "My hands were trembling so badly that day," Samuel recalled. "From pain, from blood loss, I thought I might lose the use of them entirely." "I remember," Hannah nodded. "They steadied the moment I took them in mine." Samuel raised her hand to his lips. "They've never trembled since," he told her. "Not once in all these years." Hannah leaned her head against his shoulder, their children sleeping peacefully between them as the Colorado sunset painted the sky in brilliant colors. "Some healings go beyond medicine," she said softly. "Some connections mend more than just the body." "Some loves," Samuel agreed, his arm tightening around his family, "are strong enough to steady even the most trembling hands." As darkness fell over their home, Samuel Keller reflected on the journey from that blood-soaked snow to this peaceful porch. His hands, once shaking with pain and uncertainty, now moved with confident purpose through days filled with creativity, family, and love. All because a schoolteacher with healing hands had found him when he needed her most, and together they had built a life neither had imagined possible alone.